Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Board Gaming Doctor. My name is Phil, and I am joined with Dr. Jacob, and we have just played Leviathan Wilds. So, Jacob, it is late. We just finished playing this game, and so we'll just get into it without much of a preamble. Now, Jacob, you suggested playing this game this week. And
Yes.
So what brought this onto your radar? Because from what I have learned from your tastes in games, you usually go for games that are a little bit older and you don't quite ride the waves of the latest hotness. And this is very much the hotness right now, or a part of it at least. And so what brought it on your radar?
Yeah, so I'm always really interested in board games that are trying to do something video gamey, right? I was talking with a friend about this just the other day. My research is about nature and video games, and when board games try to replicate like systems or behaviors that are kind of video gamey, I'm really interested in that. And this caught my eye because I'm a huge fan of the game Shadow of the Colossus, which is all about kind of hunting these giant colossi. It's one of the first games I ever played where it has a twist ending that, like, not to spoil it, but you're not doing what you think you're doing the whole game, right? So really wonderful video game, really exciting, intense game. And I saw this and I was like, this is doing Shadow of the Colossus. This is doing it so well because you have these giant colossi, you're climbing, you have like the specific weak points, which is a very video gamey thing, right? You know, you have the glowing weak spots on the boss that you stab and hit. And so this just shouted video game to me, right? And so I was really interested in trying to see, watching playthroughs, you can kind of get an idea of, yes, this looks like it kind of captures Shadow of the Colossus, but I wanted to play it to see how well it captured that feeling of kind of like climbing those colossi and having that tense like grip for your life, right? And I think this is a really, really interesting adaptation of those ideas into like an analog game form.
For sure. And I do have some experience with the video game as well, mostly in watching my brother play it, years ago on the PlayStation. It was such a ride, literally, as you're riding these colossi, but it was really fun and iconic. It's one of those video games that stands out through the test of time. And so when I think I remember this game being announced last year. I believe it was officially designed and published last year, but I think it's back on Kickstarter or GameFound right now, I think, for the some expansion material. But anyway, I never had the chance to play it either when it was available last year. And so you brought it back onto my radar as well. And as everyone can see, we have just finished a game here. And so let's get into a little bit of a debrief on what this game, how it plays like, and what we thought of it as well, with any game comparisons along the way. So essentially, if I were to break this game down, and like you said, thematically integrating this into how much similarity it has to the video game itself. And I will say, if you haven't played the video game, you won't really need to worry about any of that, backstory or any experience with that in the first place. But in any case, what you do, this game is very much a hand management game where you combine a deck of a certain flavor. For example, I have the Roughneck deck here. I mixed it with a character, the Kestrel, and there are 2 cards associated with that. You create a deck of 10 cards, and you play these cards and they're multi-use in nature, to either use for action points to move around the board, to move around in different ways, to strike the crystals that will free the Leviathan from its blighted state. You can rest on ledges, you can heal, and do some anytime actions as well. And essentially, like as Jacob mentioned in the video game, you're trying to move around this board, destroying these crystals, which are represented in strength and as well as type by these dice. And so if you remove them all, you win the scenario, you beat the boss. And there are plenty of ways to lose, of course, if you both lose health. Actually, Jacob did unfortunately pass away
I died.
in this game. If you're, as you attack the blue crystals, you gain blight, and it kind of raises the ceiling or the floor for how low your health can go, and if they pass, you die. And I don't know if you die if this gets to the final rage track. I think.
Yeah, I think if you reach there, you get like what it's called the last chance. I think you get one more turn, then if there's certain crystals,
okay, that makes sense. But as you progress through the game, you take a turn you have one of these threat cards revealed, which are associated with these bosses that Leviathans that you're trying to help out or destroy or whatever, and they give you certain penalties along the way, essentially. And so it's kind of a push and pull. You take a turn, the Leviathan takes a turn, does damage, and you try to mitigate that damage and try to cleverly use your cards either for the action points or for their special abilities as well that you can play for free to not only help yourself but help each other out, moving around and destroying and striking down these crystals. So any other mechanical insights that you want to talk about before we move on, Jacob?
I'm interested in some thematic integration. Do you want to talk about that now, or should I save that?
Let's go for it. Let's combine our thoughts on thematic integration and game comparisons, because I have a few comparisons that I want to make as well. So you go for it first, and then I'll jump in.
Yeah, and I think no matter what, many reviews that you listen to will compare this to Shadow of the Colossus, so I don't want to kind of beat the dead horse here, but since that's what's initially drew me to this game, I wanted to touch on some of the things I think this is doing really cleverly. Yeah. And some of the things I think it does really clever things in attempting to adapt video gamey behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. I think the turn structure is really loose in this in a really interesting way, because as Phil mentioned, if I'm taking my turn, I will play a card for action points. I can play my own cards for special abilities, but Phil can also do that. So if I'm taking my turn, and this happened many times where Phil would play a card to actually block damage for me, or he would allow me to strike a crystal on my turn with his cards, right? And so there are ways in which not only does it make for a more free-form kind of cooperative experience, that you're kind of exchanging abilities freely and helping each other, it makes time feel more cohesive, right? Sometimes there's a kind of thematic divide where it feels like things are happening disjointedly, and if you really think about it, it breaks your immersion a little bit. I think this captures that kind of living motion of an event unfolding in real time, right? Because I'm doing things, you're able to act during my turn, and I just love that kind of feel of real-time movement. And I think something that also kind of adds to that is that you kind of, these attack cards, these threat cards, flip over at the start of the turn. And so it's like, since these colossi are so big, they're kind of forecasting what they're about to do, right? They're swinging their arm, they're doing whatever. And you have time, because you're small and you can move faster, to respond to that, right? And so I love the thematic connection that you see the Colossus going to do something, the Leviathan going to do something, and you respond, right, in real time, and you're kind of ebbing and flowing to try and get out of the way. So I just think the sense of speed and time here is really impressively done, and it feels more organic.
It does. It feels like you're trying to memorize the fight patterns of the strike patterns of the Leviathan when you do flip these over, and you have to react to them, basically. And so I feel like that does a great job at simulating the feel that you have in games such as Shadow of the Colossus and other games where you fight bosses and they each have a strike pattern that you're trying to memorize real quick or understand in order to beat them. Yeah. Now, I agree too that the sense of the flow of the game is pretty seamless, and I think the only hiccup that would happen is when you get to the end of this flipping over the 5 threat cards. You have to gather them together, shuffle them, and deal them out face down. So it's not that big of a deal. I did feel that the flow between each of our turns, not only because of the cards that we could play to help each other out, but the sense of, okay, I take my turn, I draw back up, you immediately go into your turn by flipping over the threat card. It felt like it really flowed between us too when we were playing this game, and so not a lot of downtime, and there was definitely a lot of interaction that I felt like was present as I was observing what you were doing on your turn and seeing if I could help out. So
yeah, and you feel kind of actively engaged on the other person's turn, which is not in co-op games you often have quarterbacking, or in a lot of co-op games that I like, right, like co-op expansions where you're both kind of playing your same engine but cooperating on a common goal. You kind of are like, okay, I'm interested in the common goal, but I'm not as interested in what you're doing on your turn. This is a really cool middle ground between those two, right? You can't necessarily quarterback because they have their own hand of cards, their own set of actions, but you can chip in and offer to help, right? And so I think that I really like what this is doing in terms of giving you some space to both pay attention to other people and have your own sense of agency with your own game.
Exactly. Yeah. And so thinking about games that I could compare this to in the board game realm, in particular, the first game that came to mind was Aeon's End. Have you played that game?
Yes,
Yeah.
I have, yeah.
And so I found it very familiar because both games feature a boss battle. You have a scenario in which you are defeating a particular boss with certain skills or different threats that are unique to it. You alternate between a boss turn and your turn. There's hand management, card management going on as well. Whereas in Aeon's End, it's much more of a deck builder where you have a market of cards to purchase from. And here you don't. You just have your 10 cards that you kind of cycle through and hope that you draw out in a certain sequence to help you in certain situations. But the overall flow of the game, as well as the not the thematic sense of it, but just how this type of cooperative game works, where you are fighting a single boss and you're managing cards to be able to defeat them, felt very similar to how I felt when playing Aeon's End. Of course, you can compare this game to other cooperative games such as Pandemic. I would compare this to Spirit Island as well. Not in terms of complexity for rules, because Spirit Island is a harder game to learn. But in this game, I did get the sense that, like you mentioned, Jacob, the quarterbacking aspect is not as prevalent here, because it is, in a sense, theoretically more feasible to do it in this game because it's not as complex as, say, Spirit Island. You can look at your cooperative players' hand of cards to say, hey, maybe you could do this or that. It's not too deep of a game that you can do that, but I felt like I was mostly paying attention to what I could do with my own cards, how I could use my cards to help you out, rather than looking at your cards only and telling you what to do. And so that's what Spirit Island is known for. It avoids the quarterbacking aspect because of its complexity. But in this game, I think the cooperative nature of us kind of roaming around different parts of the Leviathan and figuring out our own little puzzles to be able to strike down crystals efficiently and get to little edges or ledges safely before falling down and losing grip, etc. I felt like that puzzle management for our own situations, because we were in different spots pretty much the whole game until we got to here, actually, until the very end. But I felt like that was enough for me to really just pay attention to my own deck of cards and my own hand management rather than hovering over yours. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah. And I was just going to add, this also reminds me a bit of two games, and they're both superhero games, right? Which is kind of funny. I look at this and I don't think superheroes immediately, but for me it reminds me of another Greater Than Games game, which is Sentinels of the Multiverse, where you have kind of set decks for individual characters who play their own way, have their own set of abilities, fighting a common enemy in an environment, right? So, and just as a side note, the decks here really made a huge difference. Like, I was the Breaker, which I didn't quite understand that until we started playing, and I was like, oh, when I destroy a crystal, I get to hop, or I get to move, or I get to do something, right? So there are certain things that I specialize at that also trigger bonus abilities. And your deck was very focused on blocking and moving, and they felt significantly different, right? Where I was doing, I was incentivized to do very different things. So in that way, it felt, my main point of reference is Sentinels, right? Where these main decks feel so different and are so specialized. And I love the idea of, you have one core set of threats, right? These 5 cards at the bottom are your kind of main threats that you're worrying about. But the way that you actually beat the game is by moving around and defeating other little enemies, right? These little crystals on the board are your main targets. So in that aspect, I actually was reminded a bit of Marvel United. In that there is a little bit of spatial planning, right? So you need to be in the right place at the right time, have the right cards to play the punches, right, to beat your little enemies, and then you have the main bad guy who can hit you basically no matter where you are, right? So I feel like the character asymmetry from Sentinels reminds me kind of this, and then the kind of spatial moving around to be in the right place at the right time element reminded me a bit of Marvel United.
Cool.
And Marvel United kind of has that, they call it the storyline, where you play a card and it also activates the previously played card. I feel like the card synergies here have that same type of energy. So yeah, weird comparisons, but this feels very similar to those games.
As soon as you said superheroes, I thought, oh yeah, Sentinels of the Multiverse, you're going to talk about it, but it makes a lot of sense. I think that is a great great comparison to how this feels as far as a cooperative game goes. So let's wrap it up. I'll do a separate segment for peer review and keep it at that. Mm-hmm. But and I'll go ahead and put my final thoughts after I do that and edit that in. So Jacob, do you want to leave us with your final thoughts? I'm going to pull out some of these other Leviathans, as you can see too. Maybe just to talk about our game real quick too. So this is the number 2 Sentinel. Its difficulty is a 1 out of 4, and we played it casually. It was our first time going around and playing this game. We won basically on the very last turn. I had enough action points to defeat the crystal, which would have really brought me to the end of my life as well. I think 2 turns before I did, that's when you died. But you would have died a lot sooner if you hadn't pulled one of these mushroom tokens here. They do various things. He pulled this one, where that one healed 1 blight. Jacob, unfortunately, had accumulated a lot of blight during the first half of the game. And so if he hadn't drawn that at that certain time, with how, with the way that his life was going, he would have died a lot earlier. And so if he hadn't pulled that would have ended our game prematurely. But he pulled it. It was a really awesome moment, and so there was a rush of good feelings there, and it was a really close game despite it being considerably.
No, there's like.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was like an adrenaline rush, right?
Yeah.
I think this is another thing that this game captures really well, was with the grip, right? You're so worried about running out of grip, because if you fall, you have negative effects that can happen. You're worried about your blight getting too high, right? There are just multiple kind of health bars that you're trying to juggle at once, right? You have your normal health, you have your blight, and you have your grip. And I think all of those just give you a nice little puzzle to try and work through, managing, keeping them all at their best. Which, obviously, I died, right? But that moment where I drew that thing, I took the risk to go get the mushroom, and it ended up healing me. It was such a risk reward, right? It felt so good that I was able to pull that off.
Yeah, it was really, really fun. So yeah, I'm just gonna go through some of these other Leviathans that the game provides. So there's a lot of replayability, not only in the bosses that you fight, but also the combinations of different characters and decks that you can play with. And so there is that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But any final thoughts about this game? Would you play it again? And would you recommend it? Etc. What are your final thoughts, Jacob?
Yeah, for me, I'm really excited about this game. It has just that really, it's, as you mentioned, it's not very complex, right? Like, the actual complexity level is not very high. But what it does do well is it has tension, and it has interesting decisions turn by turn. And I think the variety of the types of characters that you're able to play, combined with, I believe there are 17 Leviathans, which is an absurd amount. Like, that is so many. I think that is really cool. I'm excited about the variety. I'm excited about kind of the clever ways that the game has of managing multiple health bars, and I'm really excited about the kind of not asynchronous, but actually the loose turn structure.
Yeah.
Right. That it's pretty loose in when you can do things. So I really like this game. I'm impressed not only with how it kind of adapts that kind of boss monster, or the kind of boss fight video game moment, right? That kind of boss fight, like telegraphing moves, hitting the weak points, but also just impressed with how it merges that with really clever use of hand design and asymmetric player powers. So I think it's a really nice middle ground between kind of adapting a video game and also just being a pretty interesting board game.
For sure. I agree. So thank you, Jacob, for recommending this game, and I'll wrap us up a little bit later, but yeah, I appreciate the recommendation and your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to play this, and I'd love to play it again.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Jacob. Hey everyone, this is Phil again. So I just wanted to wrap up some final thoughts while I've had time, since we were recording pretty late, and so I quickly went over some of the comments on Board Game Geek as a peer review. Most of them are very positive. Everyone really praises this game for how well it does a cooperative type of experience in such a short amount of time, but still being able to apply mechanisms and an overall feeling of cooperation that does not include a lot of piggybacking or quarterbacking, alpha gaming. And so, like we mentioned in our previous discussion, I think a lot of people concur that this game does this pretty well, and it does it in a really good amount of time. Everyone really loves the theme. I think it's one reminiscent of Shadows of the Colossus, but even if you aren't familiar with that experience in that game, the theme itself feels very nice. There are mixed reviews about the components. One, the spiral notebook is really nice. We've seen that in a couple of other games like Jaws of the Lion, for example, for Gloomhaven, where a spiral notebook makes the map creation a lot easier. However, some people feel like it's too small, or there's some issues with some of the cardboard components as well. So if you have a physical version or looking to buy a physical version of this game, keep that in mind. Some people enjoy the experience, but they don't feel like there's a lot of replayability among the characters that you can select, the decks that you can mix and match together, as well as the Leviathans themselves. However, some people do note and say that the intro Leviathans, the ones that you are tackling, number 1 and number 2 in particular, are pretty straightforward, but then some of the other Leviathans that you get into, and I think there's 16 in total, provide a lot more of that thematic replayability as well, where not only are they more challenging, but they also, depending on the type of Leviathan that you're fighting, the threat cards and the things that the Leviathan is trying to do to injure you are more interesting as you go along. And so, to wrap this up, another game that I think is a great comparison to this is Marvel Champions, in the sense that, one, it is a cooperative game, it's very thematically driven, in the sense that you have Marvel characters and their decks, as well as the villains that you're matched up against as well, not only can be mixed and matched, but the way that the villains play, or that the way that you play as the hero in that game, the cards have a certain ability that, or a certain mix of abilities that make it feel like you're playing as Spider-Man, or etc. And so the same is seen here in Leviathan Wilds, where the characters that you play as are represented in a thematic way, but I think more so with the Leviathans and the types of bosses that you're trying to fight. They often have a lot of flavor introduced through those threat cards in the way that they injure you. And so there's a lot of comparisons there where you're more worried about looking out and trying to see what kind of cards and abilities you have to help others as well as yourself, rather than flipping that script and looking at what other people are doing and collectively trying to solve a puzzle, which does lead to some quarterbacking issues. And so this game, while Leviathan Wilds, while it is more of a spatial puzzle, as you are moving your characters around this board in a spatial sense and trying to get to those gems to break them and such, even though it has that element which may be prone to quarterbacking in other games, the way that it is set up with how you manage your hand and the deck of cards that you're trying to go through makes it so, to me, it makes it feel less so that you're trying to look at and tell what other people should do. And so I really appreciate that. Cooperative games have been on my mind recently as I've been playing more Pandemic throughout this year, the legacy version of it at least, as well as Spirit Island on a more regular basis as well. I think if you enjoy cooperative games like those mentioned before in my previous recording with Jacob, as well as games like Marvel Champions, Spirit Island, etc., but you want to play something that's a little bit lighter to teach, a little bit lighter to play, and that goes by a little bit quicker as well, with that thematic edge. If you are a fan of games like Shadows of the Colossus, or just want that kind of boss battling type of experience in about a half an hour to an hour or so, then Leviathan Wilds might be a good fit for you. So once again, thank you for listening to this episode. Hope you schedule an appointment with us real soon, and I'll catch you on the next one.